we created this thing called hunt forward. Where's the hunt backward?
Love it.
Right? Inside our own infrastructures.
Colonial Pipeline, there was SolarWinds, there was WannaCry, not Petya, OPM, Sony. How many of these have we been through? These quote unquote watershed moments that were going to change everything.
Yeah.
And they didn't.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week I have the privilege to sit down with two amazing Americans focused on cyber issues. First, we have General Edward Cardon. General Cardon spent 36 plus years in service for the U.S. Army, including as the commanding general of Army Cyber Command, and also went on to help stand up Futures Command, if I'm not mistaken. And Josh Stiefel, who has been a staff leader on Congress and the House Armed Services and shepherded the last 7 National Defense Authorization Acts, or NDAAs. And anyone in Washington knows there's only one bill that passes, and that's the NDAA. Gentlemen, it's a privilege to sit down with both of you today. You're at the forefront of a major effort that CSIS and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Cyber Solarium 2.0, which I'm part of, is leading, looking at whether or not we need a cyber force. Before we get to answering that question, I would love to diagnose where we are and what's leading some of the thinking there. And General Cardon, maybe we start with you. And what are we lacking right now in terms of our overall capacity, and anything from your amazing work at R Cyber that can be helpful in this thinking?
So there was this idea of having Cybercom 2.0. I think a lot of people realized when Cybercom was created in 2010, and here we are in 2023, 2024 timeframe, that it just is not where it needs to be. It's doing great work, but not at the scale and breadth that we know we're going to need. And when you look forward, that problem is going to get worse. And so even General Nakasone said, the force we have today is not the force we need for the future. But look how much effort it has taken to stand up the force we have today. And are there better ways to do that? So one of the challenges is that this debate's been going on a long time. Do we need a cyber service? But what's interesting as we try to continue to strengthen Cyber Command continues to ask for more and more responsibilities that look service-like. And so there is a debate whether you should have an operating force and a generating force under the same leadership. That remains to be seen because the cyber domain's a little bit different. But in my experience, being in operations for a long time, operations tends to trump the generating force all the time. And that may not be the best way to do it for the future.
Well said. And I want to pull some R Cyber thoughts in that in a second. But Josh, and sometimes this isn't the sexy stuff. It's the organize, the train, the equip, and keeping the services on task. So what are your thoughts here?
So what's interesting is the conversations we're having today about force design and force generation, training deficiencies, training disparities, issues with recruitment, issues with readiness. They're not that different from the conversations we were having 5 years ago or 10 years ago or even 15 years ago. So we're not resolving the problems that we've been dealing with for so long, and yet we're having new problems added onto our plate because of how dynamic the domain is. And so we are in this place where we know we're not where we need to be, to General Nakasone's point, right? The status quo is the only option not on the table. But we are not really thinking dispassionately and objectively about where we should be and what will it take to get there. And what's interesting about the commission is there's actually a range of views amongst the commissioners of where we have to be. And I think that's one of the best sort of attributes we have for it. What we start off with is an ironclad assumption to move past this debate of should we or shouldn't we have a service aligned to this domain the same way we do in the maritime space, in space, in the air domain. Let's just assume the president has directed the establishment of this cyber service, right? We're going to start with, what does it have to look like? What are the options we should be considering? What are our best recommendations? And then what's a plan to actually build it out? In the case of the Space Force, they were basically told to break ground on construction without having hired an architect or sketched a blueprint. Right? We want to avoid that. We want to put the thought in on the front end to at least have something for folks in the department to compare against and plan towards, so they at least have something to work off of instead of having to figure it out, right, when we're already in a conflict with the adversary.
And General and Josh both jump in here. All of this is against the backdrop where we are talking a whole lot about leaning forward, and I'm a big proponent of that. We're never going to firewall or defend our way out of this problem. But we want to make sure that we can align and achieve the outcomes we're looking for. Structurally, are we there? What is that best case scenario?
Well, maybe if one of the reasons I'm on this commission is because one of the challenges we had with the Army cyber forces, right? So the way the decisions made to stand up a Army cyber command, and then the debate about what's in it and what's not, how to do it, that went on for almost 5 years. We don't have 5 years to, once the decision's made, let's figure it out. So we've done this in other domains. We have to recognize this domain's different, so it may not all look the same. There's certain areas that might look actually quite different. But the idea that we have a series of options on the table, here's how you might want to implement it, so we actually have real capability and a much faster than we have in other domains, I think would be invaluable to the department.
And General, one thing that I find most impressive about Army Cyber Command in particular is it tends to align with the Title 10 side of the mission, where stuff really does happen. And other services, they're doing some really unique and good work in niche areas, but it tends to have a little more of that Title 50 feel to it. And I think that's sort of where we need to be. If we're talking offensive, we've got to make sure we have not only the force structure, not only the workforce coming into the future, but also the strategic outcomes we're looking to achieve. I think there's a lot that can be gleaned from Army Cyber, and I'm not saying it because you're here, but your predecessor, Rhett Hernandez, General Nakasone was able to take some of those ideas and implement it. That's sort of what we need at the national level. Josh, any thoughts there?
So what's interesting here is, cyber's new, it's dynamic, it's different, but we almost absolve ourselves of the connections that we have and how we can look back in our own military history and say, when have we been through similar situations before, and how did these resolve themselves, right? And so we think about what's lacking here. I think about the fact that there are 7 degree granting institutions in the Navy for the maritime space. There's one in the Department of Defense dedicated to cyber, and the department tried to shut it down 4 years ago, right? Is that something that's the right thing for the department to be removing the things that we've had each service determine unilaterally, like that they require, right? So in the case of the Army, you have SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies. You have SAWS in the Marine Corps. You have SAS in the Air Force. Each service has said, I need a place where I can build and develop and teach the most exquisite planners on the planet, right? A dedicated schoolhouse just for them. In cyber, we have nothing really resembling that. And is that because we've determined and gone through an analysis that says we don't need it in this space? Or is it because there's no real proponent for it, thus it's a add-on cost for someone else to take on and a burden that they're not willing to shoulder? So when we look at the history, we've seen this movie before in the country, right? It resolves itself the same way every time. And I think about, what would a cyber force look like? Everyone can talk about the operational stuff, but what about the things that people don't think about? The intelligence support, the legal support, the targeting support. These are things where the enablement of our operations is so critical, because today we have 6,500 authorized positions in the cyber mission force. We're lucky to get even close to that, but that's a small force. And when we find sort of new things that the domain requires, dedicated targeting, foundational intelligence, science and technical intelligence, we just add that onto the plates of the operators instead of saying, no, that's something that we need on the front end as distinct from the operators, right?
I'm reminded of then General Eisenhower's quote at the time, and he often said, in preparation for battle, I have found plans to be useless, but planning to be indispensable. And I'm not suggesting plans are useless. We need them. We shouldn't be coming up with them after the adversary kicks us in the most obvious place. They should be as forward-leaning as possible. But that is very true. And I'd be curious. I tend to think we've let the adversary define our strategy because we're reacting to them. We're giving the initiative to the adversary. This done right, whether it's through a cyber force or whether it's through fine-tuning everything in a more efficient way, should have us define the strategy and basically get to a point where dissuade, deter, compel the adversary, right? We seem to do it backwards. And history is filled with examples of that. And I'd be curious, sort of bluntly, if nothing changes, if the status quo is, unlike General Nakasoni's statement, the only option on the table, what risks do we face in the next few years?
I think we already see some of them, right? Well, we have a tremendous offensive capability. If we just look at Salt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, both attributed to China, right? So they're deep inside of our critical infrastructure. Even recent reporting has said they're in really deep and we don't know how we're going to get them out. And Salt Typhoon came out and basically collected information on every American that we have.
Absolutely,
right? Then I think, that's here now. So that's on the defensive side. Like, if we're so great, how did this happen?
Absolutely.
And this is where the complications of, well, a lot of the stuff is private infrastructure, the way that the department, Admiral Rogers used to talk about, the FBI has these authorities, CISA has these authorities, DOD has almost no authorities inside the United States, right?
Except with the DIB, right?
Except with, that grew over time. It didn't start that way, right? It started because people got smart about a way to attack the United States is to start going up the chain and influence the weapons and capabilities we need to actually conduct war.
Which is a bad story. And the broader mission assurance picture is not great either.
That part's here. Now, how do we, and in a weird way, you could say we could take the offensive force, let me back up a little bit. Maybe we created this thing called Hunt Forward, which I think is fantastic, right? Working with other nations, super, and worked really well with the Ukraine. Where's the Hunt Backward?
Love it.
Right? Inside our own infrastructures. Where is that and who does it? Because right now that's not even sorted out.
That's really well said. And if you think about it, the ability to project power, deploy forces, that's all in that side of the house, right? To ensure that we actually have an offensive capability, whether kinetic or cyber or the convergence of the two, which is where I am. Josh, anything, if nothing changes today, what is this picture, which is already a bad picture, to be honest?
Absolutely. We continue to let the adversaries sort of set the tone and tenor. And, my biggest fear is that no country in the world is better prepared for a 20th century conflict than we are, right? But that's not the one we're fighting. The adversaries have picked up on that. China developed its cyberspace force, 9 years ago. I'd argue the Israelis are the world's first independent cyber force, right? They're leading the way because you put these guys together and some magic happens. And so we're going to continually be following until we're leading. And I don't know what it's going to take because, to the point about the typhoons, before typhoons, there was, Colonial Pipeline, there was Solar Winds, there was WannaCry, NotPetya, OPM, Sony. How many of these have we been through? These quote unquote watershed moments that were going to change everything.
Yep.
And they didn't, right? So how cataclysmic does an incident have to be to get us to actually move one way or the other.
And I appreciate that, because the Typhoons alone, each one of those, whether Salt, Volt, and Volt being the one that I think is most indicative of intentions crossing a line, a Rubicon, Flax, Silk, you name the Typhoon, each one is a really bad day. Collectively, it's the perfect storm. And the fact that we, at least publicly, haven't made it a much bigger set of issues is going to send a signal to all of our adversaries that this is okay, right? And we just need to do more there. And I'd be curious what you think has to be at Cyberforce, say it is a new force on day one. What has to be included in all that? And I know you're looking at that in your study, but either of you want to jump in? You want to start, Josh?
I think the ability to incorporate the massive amount of talent that's in the civilian workforce, right? Whether they're there in a full-time capacity or in a part-time reserve or guard capacity, right? You need people who understand the private sector, who can talk the talk of industry and understand what the department oftentimes fails to understand today in terms of, fiduciary interests of companies and the different incentive structures that they have, the regulatory compliance they're obligated under. You need people that understand that. And so I think that has to be a foundational piece. Now, what form it takes, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting topic for us to be discussing within the commission. But I know that we can't do this without harnessing those folks with experience in uniform, but now also in the civilian sector.
And that's what makes cyber really unique, is there, in some cases, maybe governments, and it's not leading, they're actually supporting the mission of, certainly on the defensive side. But I'd be curious what that looks like, and agree. What are some, please?
So Frank, I would say part of the work of the commission has to separate out a number of lines, right? And I believe in boundaries, because if you don't have a boundary, then everybody thinks they own that turf. But if you create a boundary, then people have to coordinate to cross it. It's not impermeable, but there's coordination required. So if you look at the boundaries on the offensive side, a lot of that smashes up against the intelligence community.
Absolutely.
So what are the boundaries, right? When you look at the defensive side, it comes up against the CIO community. So what is that? But also there's these other ones that are emerging rapidly, like what about the EW community? Absolutely. Like tactical cyber may look a lot like EW.
And RF.
And so that brings in the whole spectrum piece. Then you also have information operations, influence operations, with cyber's certainly an enabling force for this in a massive way. So we haven't sorted these out. The commission is going to offer a number of recommendations around this. So when you say what it looks like, I think if you would sort these roles out and they're decided and not relitigated once a decision's made, this is the importance of implementation work, could be super powerful for day one.
Love it. And I would just add, and not to be too academic or wonky, but we tend to look at the world through our boxes and org charts. If we could look at it in terms of what outcomes we genuinely want to achieve, our boxes and org charts would look very different, I think. And maybe that would be a way to sort of factor in across that spectrum of conflict would be really valuable.
And related to this point, what's an issue that I've been very frustrated with is progress on weapon system cybersecurity and defense industrial base cybersecurity. And
this isn't
really,
secret squirrel stuff.
No,
GAO has made this very
Absolutely.
public for years.
And what really concerns me is you get the principals together in the Pentagon. You can have 10 different principals and you say who's in charge, and 10 hands go up. To say that we organize by org chart, like, this is the problem, is that no one knows whose job it is to take care of these massive issue sets that we still have not addressed or mitigated.
What do you see some of the pros and cons, shortfalls of maybe other structures? So for transparency, 10 years ago, I wrote extensively on the need to create a JSOC, because I thought the ability to deconflict the Title 50, Title 10, I come at it from post 9/11. I think the the greatest breakthrough is actually ensuring that the intelligence and defense communities can come together on prosecuting the war on terrorism. Some would say NSPM 13 was the equivalent of that for cyber. At least it didn't require the president to read over every single operation and sign it one way or another. What are some of the shortcomings of that model? And then more importantly, how would a service sync up with Cyber Command right now? I'd be curious what, General, we'll start with you and then Josh.
Well, I still think Cybercom will be the operational force. It'll be the COCOM that implements. So it'll operate just like all the others. And so this cyber force would present forces to Cyber Command. What might be different here, though, going to Josh's earlier point, is not only would it have to present forces also to the other combatant commands, it might actually have to present forces to services.
Yep.
Right? And no other generating force does it like that,
exactly.
Right? On the point of, I do believe in a JSOC-like function, Cyber National Mission Force. Where I
CNMF, you think's doing that?
Well, I used to talk about it in that. It's become a sub-unified command. I think this is something worth looking at.
From
right?
a planning perspective.
Well, if the Cyber National Mission Force by default becomes the operational force, then you have one force, right? Well, the Army has lots of, we have 4 corps for a reason. We have 12 divisions for a reason, right? So that kind of structure, is in the generating forces. And then I'll stop there.
Josh?
Well, on the point of JSOC, right, we don't have to think about a JSOC for defense. We do have to think about cyber for defense, right? And so for all the good work that CNMF does, I am always concerned that, the offensive side gets far more attention, far more resourcing than the defensive side. I want to treat the newly renamed DCDC as an equivalent to CNMF. And I want them to get as many resources, as much prioritization to make sure that we don't take our eye off that we're not always sort of lured by, the sexiness of offensive operations, because where do we have the most control over our ability to affect the network, affect the terrain? It's inside our own network.
Just to put a fine point on that, and I'll let you finish. I mean, what you will hear from industry is they will pay for the real or perceived sins of government leaning forward anyway, because they're going to be on the front lines of the retaliation and response. So it's even more complicated in that you've got critical infrastructure owners and operators who need a seat at this table as well. So sorry to cut you off.
No. And to your point, right, who is responsible in the Pentagon to talk to the private sector about this issue? Because I can tell you that there's far more than the number one that will say that they're in charge of it, right? That's a problem for us. I think that there's some real goodness going on at DCDC under General Stanton, thinking about this, thinking holistically. I know there's been, really good interplay between DCDC and the Defense Cyber Crime Center, also known as DC3, maybe bringing those organizations together because they're basically looking at different sides of the same coin.
And there are also good relationships, led by General Hartman on linking them with the CNMF.
That's
right?
essential. Yep.
So there are pieces. The question is it enough, right? And
it would let them focus on a mission that's narrower, right? I mean, at the end of the day, not narrow. Operations is never, but it's not everything and everywhere all the time. Is that fair? Is that one of the arguments?
I kind of back all the way out of that. Like the IT is everywhere all the time running, so we have to have a way to monitor it, right? Artificial intelligence is really like upping the game on the defensive side. It's also
on the offensive side.
It's also
too.
doing it to the offense, right?
Yep.
And so speed matters. So I mean, this is an area that the commission also has to explore. I do want to highlight one thing that Josh said. He talked about the people. I've always believed the people are the key to this whole thing. We get enamored with the technology over here, but it's actually, when you meet one of these people that's, I call them one of one of the 100s. Like there's 100 people in the country that can do this.
That's awesome.
And, it's a very unique skill set, but there's only a couple of them that know how to do it. We need those.
We need to expand
people.
that pool.
We need to attract them, and we may not need them in the force, but we need access the force needs access to them.
Actually, I do want to get your thoughts, because workforce, everyone talks about it. There's not a whole lot of doing there. It's hard. I get it. And this is everything from pay scale. All these complicated back office functions are essential to being able to build the cyber workforce of tomorrow.
I think you got to start with what you want. And so for me, I've always thought it would be like 1/3 military, 1/3 civilian, 1/3 contract. The contract force is the fungibility, right? If you need something fast, you get it through the contract. But it also needs permeability. So you should be required to go in and out of the force. That includes the military, right? Go back out to private sector, go work in one of the hyperscalers, go work in one of the big social media, come back.
So do we really need a Goldwater Nichols that expands into industry, though? That's the difference. It's not just you have to spend some time in another service or bill it to get promoted. I think
when you look at it, we have found solutions to this, right? In other domains, we know how to solve for this. And so, whether you look at the Guard, whether you look at Title 32 authorities, or we found creative ways to address the operational problem. And is it at scale? Probably not. But then that gets to the question of, okay, what enablers have you provided or, facilitated? In this case, I'd say a JAG Corps, right? Who are experts in the legal changes that might be required to make something a reality. And so to me, that's where I think we have to really think broadly about organized, train, and equip. That means a lot of things. One is the enablers.
Can I push back on that a teeny bit? It's not that I disagree with it, I do. But we're very good when we have a specific campaign we're running up against. Ukraine and Russia invades Ukraine. We have ways where we can bring both on the red and the blue, offense, defense, together to ramp up capabilities. It's that every other day, and we want to make the big mistakes on the practice field, not Main Street USA when it matters, right? So how do we find, I mean, this is not to be trite, but you got to do the reps to be good in anything. And that's not when the balloon goes up. That's every day before that.
But if you look at CNMF's program under advisement, if you look at the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center run out of NSA,
which
massive successes because they found ways to creatively get after, is there a disparity between what the government is seeing in a threat picture and what the private sector is seeing? Mm-hmm. Can we talk about it? Are there liability protect? Are there whatever it may be? They've found creative ways to tackle each one of these in small bites. And so I do think that we got to give ourselves a little bit of credit here that there is those solutions. It just may not be at the scale where
maybe it's CCC on steroids. Because the next level of question is, I'm tired of the public-private partnership discussion. It's all about operational collaboration, and that is going to be with industry too. And maybe CCC is a model you can put on steroids. And I assume this is agnostic to whether or not there's a cyber force, right? That can plug in. But how do we get around that workforce issue? How do we get it so we're not getting every one of those 100? If they're not here today, we can build them tomorrow.
Well, the first thing to back up to do this training, the force has to be bigger than when you actually need.
Yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. And often we don't think about it that way. So what percentage of the force is in an education or training mode, right? And that's where you start to see, you get questions like who's going to write the doctrine, who's going to do all that. Well, I view that as a generating force responsibility, but it has to be in this domain tightly coupled with the operational piece. But rather than being in the operation, you should be watching it and then extend it out. What does that look like down the road? They have time to think about that. That's their job as opposed to get after target.
And I love that because it's the enabling function. It's the gap between strategy and tactics. And that tends to be in every field, but even more so when it comes to cyber and building out that doctrine. But it also means you have to invest So, not to use a bad sports analogy, but do you try to build your team based on who's going to win today, or do you build your team where you will win for the next 10 years? And you have to invest in those future first-round picks. Every once in a while, give up a key position, right?
So there was a lot of criticism about a Space Force saying we can't afford to reorganize now. It would be too detrimental, too costly. We made that decision in 2019. The question was settled. Are we glad now that we have a group of people, a cadre of folks thinking about space warfare 24/7? Because now in 2025, that looks quite prescient, right? So we don't really have buyer's remorse about that decision. Going back to the workforce issue, I mentioned the Israelis, right? Everyone turns to the Israelis. They're the startup nation, incredible high-tech sector, incredible talent. There's a direct correlation from Unit 8200 to the development of a workforce that's populating their private sector, right? So they invest in it early. They invest in it, at the primary and secondary education level to prepare Israeli, boys and girls for 8200 to then be selected and assessed, trained on an unbelievable investment in order to say, their length of service, it still is worth it to the nation because they're working in the private sector and they're coming back maybe as a reservist.
And they live in a tough neighborhood and they get a lot of experience and everyone's serving.
So Frank, this is building the ecosystem, right? And the ecosystem normally is not built inside of operational force. Operational force is worried about what's in front of it today, or maybe a week from now, or 2 weeks, or a month, certainly not more than a year, right? They're knocking down targets, accomplishing mission every day. The generating force is the one that generally thinks deeper, right? And this idea of building the ecosystem, that is the long-term solution, right? The long-term solution is to build these, because then, I laugh with my private industry friends, right? They're poaching talent out of this cyber mission force, DCDC, which would be okay if they kept coming back.
If they come back,
right?
Exactly.
And I think you could start to create this engine that would generate an unbelievable force. 10 years from now, to Josh's earlier point in the Space Force, to be like, wow, that was an incredible decision.
And I would agree 100% and do when I speak to students. You have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in terms of public service. You're going to see and play, and let's be serious, the mission matters. But I think we have to get out of you're expected to be anywhere for 50 years. That's just not lining up with the real workforce. It has to be go in, out, and then ideally learn from. You're taking lessons you're learning, you're understanding the pain points, you know what the Advil or whatever is needed to address it, and vice versa. But our system's not built for that.
But that's a function of this domain. Unlike
any other domain.
You in the Army, that land domain's very specific. Anybody want to take a guess on which the big companies are going to be 5 years from now in this IT space with this AI environment? That's if we could figure that out.
Who could have guessed I'd be investing, right?
So that's so fast moving. That's why I think they need to go in and out because, as they say, from the time you start your computer science program to the time you graduate, it's OB.
Yep.
Right?
Well said. True. But there's nothing more valuable than experience, scar tissue, and actually
foundational education.
So, one of the privileges of my former role on the committee was talking to operators at all levels, right? And one of the things, I saw that I think does the service members a real disservice is saying, we just can't compete with the private sector, for pay. I don't think people are leaving because of pay. That might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. They're leaving because they're in institutions that don't view them as valuable to their core mission. And so if we had an organization or we had an institution where they're seen as valued, where they're seeing leaders above them that came from their communities, that can speak their language, that have been through what they've been through, that have, found success in this domain, you show them that there's not just an incentive, right? But there is a pathway. And you're not treated as an other,
Is that
we
a
know
failure of leadership, Josh, when you really get down to it more so?
I don't fault the services. Like, I want the Air Force thinking about air warfare 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't want them to have to balance that with the competing prioritization of a different domain. I think that gets to the heart of, the view that I have, at least, that we build our military services per the warfighting domains. We have 5 domains, and we've built services for 4 out of those 5. I want I want the Army thinking about land warfare all the time. I don't want it to have to balance it with anything else.
But the flip side is you want every service to appreciate the cyber component of their existing AORs,
you need
right?
generalists and you need specialists, right? And so if you had a cyber service, right, it doesn't absolve the Army from having to care about cyber. Just their lens and their perspective is going to be different. We created an Air Force, but we didn't take planes away from the Navy and the Marine Corps, right? We created a cyber force. You're not telling the Army they don't have to care about their network anymore because it's someone else's job. You're saying to the Army, you have to get these functions right, those that are related to your ability to conduct ground operations, right? And that involves, there's going to be a cyber component to that. But that's different from saying that Army, at the same time that you're building formations for infantry and maneuver and fires, you also have to think about cyber, which isn't going to support those. That's really the situation we have today.
And this is one of those lines that the commission's going to have to take a look at, because you could see a service easily say, well, you created a cyber force. You should provide those to me.
Exactly.
Right? But the problem is and having, been in the Army, that we want to have some cyber personnel that are experts in the land domain, right? So they understand it from that domain.
Sea or undersea or space.
It does.
Or
You're
you
right.
name it,
So the question is, people are like, are they in or out? Well, okay, let's focus
Yes.
on
And
mission.
yes.
Let's focus on mission, and based on mission, form follows function, right? Form follows function.
And General, I love that you brought that up, because form should always follow function. I'd be curious, and we're running out of time, but I want to make sure that the old adage, what gets measured gets done, but are we measuring what matters? What are the MOEs? What should success look like? And not to sound like the typical, but the DC way is create something new so you don't have to fix what wasn't fixed. How do we ensure that we're building something that we can all be proud of 20 years from now?
So let's look at a really current example, right? Operation Midnight Hammer, the strikes against the Iranian nuclear program, something that required unbelievable precision. You had, maneuver between tankers, bombers, unique ordnance being dropped. Could that have been pulled off by the Navy? Could that have been pulled off by the Marine Corps? Could it have been pulled off by the Army? No, right? Why? Because you had an Air Force that had been making investments through the years, because all the things that were involved in that operation are things that we've been laying the groundwork on investments for decades, right? Tanker technology, refueling, ordnance, the R&D that goes into that. You don't develop that overnight. And so that was a byproduct that no one could have envisioned when this debate was being had in the 20s and 30s. And even in the 50s, when we already had an Air Force, thinking about how we're going to be able to cross halfway around the globe. But are we glad that we did that? Because someone was in charge and said, I better make these investments today because I might need it down the road.
General?
Cyber is very hard to measure. This leads directly to cyber deterrence, right? Which I know on the Solarium Commission you talked about a lot. It's very hard to measure.
Lots of views there.
And so I think this is an area that needs a lot more research, right? We have a very hard time measuring cyber effects. We know when the cyber effect is measured in something physical, like the Dabiq magazine in ISIS went away. That wasn't by accident, right? Now, that's a very small example, but so we can see that,
absolutely,
right? But for a lot of this stuff, very hard. It's measured by an attack, a successful attack. I wouldn't even, unlike people that say I get attacked a million times a day. Exactly. Of course, you're getting scammed, right? Probably some of it's by the teenager down the road. But my point is these MOEs are really important down the road because as we start doing more and more operations, it's all about where we put our money, right?
Absolutely.
We got to be able to show that we're spending this money well.
And policy without resources is rhetoric, and it's hard to disprove double negatives. That's what makes this business so hard. It's the same challenges you have in the intelligence community, but on steroids. Gentlemen, what questions didn't I ask that I should have? We covered a lot of terrain. I wish we had more time. But Cost, okay. Dollars.
When thinking about, what should we do? What should we? Oh, it's too expensive, or whatever. Let's be
You never
honest.
know when you need that exquisite capability, to your point earlier.
But also we are spending an unbelievable amount of money towards this. It's just, is it being spent as well as it ought to be? From 2020 to 2025, right, public figures, we have spent $29.9 billion on cyber operations. That's enough for 2 Ford-class aircraft carriers. Do we have the equivalent combat capability in cyberspace as 2 Ford-class carriers? I'd argue no, right? So we're putting the money. Are we getting the ROI out of it that we should be expecting as citizens, as taxpayers, as defense professionals? Because that's a really scary thing, is that we are putting money towards it and we're not exacting a long-term benefit from it.
Sounds like a appropriator, but who is an authorizer in that, but well said. General, last word.
I think this is really important work. If not, the decision will be made, and then in my experience, we tend to study it for a couple of years before we implement it. We don't have that kind of time.
Well said. Gentlemen, thank you both for your commitment to these issues, for your public service over the many years, for joining us today. And in all sincerity, this is an investment we have to make now, or we're going to pay the prices in the future. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.